Hi, everyone. So, today I'm going to talk to you about colonial society. We're going to talk about mainly what the colonies really look like uh, by the first half of the 18th century. And to start us off, we need to look at uh, roughly kind of the demographics of the colonies. All of the colonies faced an early struggle to survive. But there were distinct regional differences between the colonies in New England, the Middle Colonies, the Chesapeake Bay area, and the Carolinas. And these distinct regional differences intensified and persisted throughout the colonial period. From about 1700 through 1750, the colonial population grew from about 250,000 in 1700 to over 2 million by 1750. A lot of this was growth due to natural increase. People were having more children. The colonies were a comparatively healthier place for people to live. And there was a large influx as well of migrants coming to the British North American colonies. As you can see from the table here, by far the largest population of colonists coming to the British North American colonies were not coming here voluntarily. They were African enslaved people being brought forcibly to the colonies. And that was about 278,000 between 1700 and 1775. There were also significant populations coming from Ireland, from Germany, still quite a few coming from England and Wales, a large number coming from Scotland as well, and then about 6,000 or so coming from other European places. These non-English Europeans largely settled along the colonial frontier, as you can see in the map on the right there. The coastal regions were largely settled by colonists who were from England. So this left the frontier to all of the non-English Europeans coming in. And this was about 800 miles running along the range of the Appalachian Mountains from western Pennsylvania down to western Georgia. The frontier was a very complex, very fluid, very violent mixture of Europeans, Native Americans, and some enslaved people of African heritage. So the table tells us what were the main ethnic or national groups coming to the American colonies between 1700 and 1775. It also tells us what their labor status was, and we've already talked a lot about what labor looked like in the American colonies. The number of people who were enslaved, the number of indentured servants coming to the colonies, the number of convicts being brought here, and then also the number of free laborers, people who were not indentured, people who were not convicts, people who were not enslaved, migrating to the colonies voluntarily. The map also shows us where these different ethnic groups settled once they were in the New World. And take a look and notice what you see along this map. I think it's a really interesting depiction of what the ethnic diversity in the colonies looked like and where people were settling and why. Last week I talked about the political turmoil that England experienced in the late 17th century. And particularly, I talked about the Glorious Revolution. By overthrowing the Catholic James II as the King of England, the Protestant new king, William of Orange, he plunged Protestant England into a war with Catholic France. This war was of unprecedented scale and cost. The English really didn't realize how much that coup would cost them or where it was going to lead. To compete with France, which was at that time the most powerful kingdom in Europe, the English had to build a much larger and more professional army and navy. And this had to be maintained through the creation of a state bureaucracy and was funded by higher levels of taxation. Basically, England becomes a fiscal military state that was dominated by the task of waging these wars against France. First, the English fought the 9 Years' War between 1689 and 1697 to uphold the Protestant regime, to maintain England's hold over Ireland, to preserve their American colonies, and to defend their new allies, the Dutch, from a massive French invasion. Then there was a period of peace for about 5 years until 1702, when they went to war again, the War of the Spanish Succession, which lasted until 1713. Both of these conflicts ended up being inconclusive in terms of deciding whether it was going to be the French or whether it was going to be the English who would reign as the supreme imperial power. But gradually, English power was strengthening during these wars. And it was during this period as well that England united with Scotland to form Great Britain. And the British Empire was also able, by the 1730s, to eliminate piracy in the West Indies. So these triumphs in war, in creating the British Union, and in crushing the pirates really marked a revolutionary transformation in the power of the British realm. The British were able to build their power at the expense of both the French and the Dutch. During the early 18th century, London became Europe's premier center for commerce and for high finance. Now, none of this had come cheap. The British had a massive national debt, and to pay for the expansion of the army and especially the navy, the crown had to levy taxes, particularly upon commerce. And as commerce became fundamental to British power, the American colonies became more and more important to the empire. Overseas commerce and naval warfare also became central to how the British people thought of themselves, patriotism as being part of the British Empire. The English were defining themselves as being united against the French, and the American colonists definitely participated in this, and they felt very strongly tied to their mother country. During the 18th century, the expanding trade across the Atlantic produced what historians have called a consumer revolution. And this meant that there were cheaper and more diverse goods in the colonies in greater abundance, and a lot more common people became consumers of those goods. The American colonists consumed the fruits of other locations in the British Empire, tea and spices from India, sugar from the West Indies, and British manufactured goods. The display of consumer goods was a way to elevate one's status in society. Consumer goods became more conspicuous because now there were stores in the urban areas. They displayed these goods in their windows. And newspapers, colonial newspapers, ran advertisements for all of the latest imports being brought in. And it wasn't just people in the cities who were enjoying these goods as well. Peddlers carried goods into the rural towns and in the frontier settlements. We kind of like to romanticize colonial America as a place where all of these self-sufficient, independent farmers were able to produce everything that they needed. But this wasn't really the case. No farm could produce everything that colonists needed to, that a household needed to survive. And merely subsisting, merely surviving, did not satisfy the desires of the colonists or limit their production. Every colonial farm produced crops, both to be consumed by the household, but also for a market. The colonists needed to sell produce so that they could purchase consumer goods that they couldn't make themselves. Sugar, tea, metal tools, luxury items like china cups and saucers, buttons, buckles, silverware. In colonial society, the display of consumer goods really mediated claims to status. The wealthier colonists cultivated a very conspicuous, self-conscious style. They emphasized grace and delicacy and refinement in everything that they did. They built finer and larger and more ornamental houses. Increasingly, these houses were made of brick rather than of wood. And they filled those houses with fine furniture that was all imported from England. More common people continued to live in smaller, more traditional homes, but they began to fill their own homes with some of the consumer goods that the very wealthy were also consuming. The genteel set, the elite, looked down upon common farmers and common artisans, but the common people strove as consumers to try to erase that line between gentility and commonality. And this competition for status drove commoners and the elite to buy more than they could afford. The colonies chronically imported more than they produced. So they had this chronic trade imbalance, and most colonists, most individual colonists, went into debt to try to compete for this social status. Now, as colonial society matured, we start to see different social classes emerging. The elites in the colonies were not as wealthy or as powerful as the European aristocracy, but they gradually come to dominate colonial society and politics. In New England and in the middle colonies, the elite tended to be wealthy merchants. In the southern colonies, the elite were the wealthy, large plantation owners. And although there was no titled aristocracy, there were no earls or dukes or counts or anything like that. These men of prominence also were in control of colonial government. Especially in the South, wealthy families were very closely connected and they controlled the local and colonial governments. They were known as the gentry. These colonial elites tried to model their lives on British etiquette and behavior. They tried to emulate the English aristocracy in every way that they could, except that they couldn't claim a landed title. For them, society was hierarchical, and they're on the top of the pyramid. They have the wealth, they have the prominence, and that meant they believed that they had every right to dominate the other social classes below them. And I think in part because the elite dominated social and political life so much, and they felt such strong ties to England, the overall culture of the colonies was affected very strongly by this. Now, at the bottom of the spectrum, the other end of the pyramid, were the poor, both enslaved and free. Enslaved people, of course, lived in extreme poverty. Free colonists, who were in the bottom of the social ranks, they also increased as land started to become scarcer, and this forced those who didn't own property to seek work in the cities or move from colony to colony. By about 1750, about half of the wealth in the colonies was concentrated in the hands of the richest 10% of the population. The vast majority of colonists were neither very, very wealthy, nor were they extremely poor. Most of them were small farmers who owned their own land or artisans who owned their own shop. As a result of this, land ownership, property ownership becomes a very powerful indicator of personal freedom for many colonists. As one prominent American historian has suggested, a dislike of personal dependence and an understanding of freedom as not relying on others for a livelihood sank deep roots in British North America. Now, as the political situation in England was settling down after all of the turmoil of the 17th century, the political structure of the colonies was also becoming more stable as well. As we talked about last time, colonial governments were dominated by the wealthy elite. But in general, things were a bit more democratic in the colonies than they were in England. And this was mainly just due to the fact that there was a lot more available land. And so more people could own property and thus had a right to vote. Somewhere between 50 to 80% of adult white men could vote in 18th century America, as opposed to less than 5% back in England. But we now have to keep in mind that voting everywhere in the colonies was restricted. It was restricted by sex. It was only men who could vote. It was restricted by religion. In some places, certain religious groups were prohibited from voting. It was restricted by race. property owning Black Americans who were free. In some southern colonies, they lost the right to vote in the 18th century. And in the northern colonies, local custom tended to restrict voting rights to only white men. Native Americans generally could not vote. Political leaders in the colonies, whether they were elected or whether they were appointed, generally they were not very closely connected with their constituents. Governors, colonial councils, they were not elected offices. They were appointed by the crown or by the colony's proprietor. Laws that were passed by colonial assemblies could just be vetoed by the governors or by the English government. Outside of New England, local officials as well were appointed by the governor. And property qualifications for voting, for holding office actually, were higher than they were for voting. In order to sit in the colonial assembly in South Carolina, for example, you had to have at least 500 acres of land and own at least 10 slaves, or you had to own property worth £1,000. Obviously, this led to the colonial governments being dominated by wealthy landowners or merchants. And there was a strong culture of deference in some colonies where it was just assumed that having wealth and having education and having social prominence, that meant that you had an automatic right to hold public office. In the first half of the 18th century, the British government was very preoccupied with its rivals in Europe and establishing its empire. And so they largely left the American colonies to kind of govern themselves. This was a practice that was known as salutary neglect. This resulted in the colonial assemblies becoming more and more powerful during this period. The leaders of these assemblies saw their role as being very similar to that of the British Parliament. They were heavily influenced by ideas of the European Enlightenment. They believed very firmly that they were Englishmen and they had the same rights as the Englishmen back in England. The colonies also developed a very robust public sphere. By public sphere, we mean political organization and debate outside of the government, where citizens, literate, informed citizens, regularly discussed political ideas and the issues of the day. In major cities like Boston and New York and Philadelphia, there were these clubs that sprang up where literature and science and philosophy and politics were being discussed by the elite. But it wasn't just the elite talking about these ideas. These kinds of conversations were also happening in taverns and in coffee houses. The public sphere was supported by a very literate population. Colonial America was probably the most literate society in the world in the 18th century. And it had a very strong press, which printed newspapers and broadsides and pamphlets to circulate news and ideas throughout the colonies. And many of the ideas that were spreading throughout the colonies have their root in the European Enlightenment. This was a philosophical movement that had begun in France and then had spread to England. Enlightenment thinkers sought to apply the principles of the scientific revolution, things like the scientific method, research, experimentation. They believed these things could be applied to political and social life as well. They believed that reason, not religious belief, should govern human life. And these ideas would prove to be enormously influential in the colonies. They were adopted and refined by colonial leaders like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. Now, where did these ideas of the Enlightenment come from? Often it has sort of seemed like they emerged kind of whole cloth out of Europe. The Renaissance of the 15th century certainly played a role, and the scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries was the precursor to the Enlightenment. But a very good argument can be made that European intellectuals and philosophers of the Enlightenment were also heavily influenced by the encounters that had taken place between the peoples of Europe and the indigenous peoples of North America. Now, we've already examined a lot of these encounters. We've looked at What happened when Europeans encountered the peoples and the animals of the New World. We've looked at what happened when Europeans became captives of Native Americans. So we know these encounters were happening. And they had a profound intellectual effect back in Europe. All of a sudden, Europeans now found themselves in control of vast stretches of the globe. And European intellectuals found themselves exposed not only to civilizations that were very different from their own, but to a whole host of previously unimagined social, scientific, political ideas. And the result of this flood of new ideas that resulted from the European conquest of the globe comes to eventually be known as the Enlightenment. Now, one of the big questions that came to be debated in Europe during the Enlightenment was the question of what are the origins of social inequality. They're being confronted with societies and ways of life that are totally alien to them. And to many Europeans, these societies seem to be closer in nature to the long ago origins of humankind. So European thinkers begin to ponder this question and what it meant for their own society. European traders and missionaries and settlers talked with the people they encountered in what they called the New World. They often lived among them for extended periods of time, even as they were also colluding in the destruction of this way of life and these people. We know that many of those living in Europe who came to embrace the Enlightenment principles of freedom and equality claimed that accounts of these encounters with peoples of the New World had a profound influence on their thinking. We also see that indigenous Americans who were being confronted by these strange foreigners developed their own critiques of European institutions and European society. And these critiques filtered back over to Europe, and they came to be taken very seriously. Now, asking this question, what is the origin of social inequality, isn't really something that would have occurred to anyone in Europe during the Middle Ages, before these encounters with the New World. As we've already talked about, this was a hierarchical society, and these hierarchies were assumed to have existed from the very beginning of humankind, going all the way back to creation. Social equality, and the opposite of that, social inequality, didn't really exist as a concept. The terms equality and inequality only began to be commonly used in the early 17th century, under the influence of something called natural law theory. And natural law theory arose largely in the context of debates that were happening in Europe about the moral and legal implications of Europe's encounters with the New World. Legal scholars and philosophers in Europe began to ask, well, what rights do human beings have simply because they are human? What rights do people have naturally if they exist in a state of nature without written philosophy or religion or codified laws? And the societies that they are encountering in the New World seem to be very similar to this kind of state of nature. Writers like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, these are some of the leading Enlightenment figures, they begin to ask, well, what might human beings have been like in a state of nature? Were they more free and equal than we are now? Each of these authors took for their inspiration for what a society like this might look like the very simple societies that existed in the Western Hemisphere, and they concluded that the original state of humanity was one of freedom and equality. Now, indigenous inhabitants of the Western Hemisphere, American thinkers and intellectuals who argued with Europeans about these abstract ideas, they played a definite role in this conceptual revolution of the Enlightenment. We know that many Europeans spent years learning native languages and having conversations with Native Americans, and indigenous Americans learned Spanish and French and Dutch and English. Very often, it was missionaries in particular who typically conducted these long philosophical debates as part of their professional duties, and they wrote these debates down. Travel literature and accounts by missionaries often contain summaries of or excerpts from these exchanges. This was a popular literary genre that educated Europeans read and enjoyed. One of these accounts was written down by a man named Chrétien Leclerc. He was a missionary who went to New France, and he found there that many of the Native Americans that he encountered weren't really very interested in adopting European cultural practices. And in this source that I've sort of excerpted here on the slide, Leclerc is recording the words of a Native American man who was trying to explain why he believed his way of life was superior to Leclerc's. So we can take seriously what this Native American man was saying here. It's very likely that this conversation actually occurred. And Leclerc shared this indigenous man's thoughts and views, and probably a lot of other Europeans read them at the time. So if we look at what this Native American man is saying here, what does he think about the Europeans that he's encountering? How does he see his own way of life in comparison to theirs? He says, "Thou sayest of us also that we are the most miserable and unhappy of all men, living without religion, without manners, without honor, without social order, and in a word, without any rules." So he's basically saying here, to kind of paraphrase him, he's saying, well, you think we are in just a terrible state, that we are unhappy, that we don't have any kind of societal order, that we live without any rules, without any religion. This is, sort of, you're sort of criticizing our way of life. Then he goes on, the Native American man goes on to say, "I beg thee now to believe that all miserable as we seem in thine eyes, we consider ourselves nevertheless much happier than thou." So he's saying, well, we don't see it the same way. We think we are much happier than you are. He says, "We are very content with the little that we have, and believe also that thou deceivest thyself greatly, if thou thinkst to persuade us that thy country is better than ours." He says, "For if France is a little terrestrial paradise, art thou sensible to leave it?" He says, you're not going to convince me that your country of France is better than my country of North America, because, sort of, if France is so great, why are you here? Why did you leave this little terrestrial paradise? And then he concludes by saying, "Now tell me this one thing. Which of these two is the wisest and happiest? He who labors without ceasing and only obtains, and that with great trouble, enough to live on? Or he who rests in comfort and finds all that he needs in the pleasure of hunting and fishing?" He says, I like my life. I'm free to do what I want. I can, sort of relax. I can just go out and hunt or fish and get what I need to live. And I don't have to, sort of work so hard. Whereas I look at you over there toiling away in the fields, and you're, sort of just getting what, sort of enough to live on by doing that. Which of us is happier? I think I'm a lot happier. I have more freedom, right? I'm not slaving away. The fact that indigenous Americans lived in generally more free societies and that Europeans lived in societies that were less free, this wasn't really up for debate in these kinds of exchanges. Both sides agreed that this was the case. What they differed on was whether or not individual liberty was a desirable thing. And it's kind of hard for us living in a 21st century world to understand how Europeans in the 17th century might not see individual liberty as an inherently good thing. Our views today on things like personal freedom, the equality of men and women, might be closer to those of an indigenous American of the 17th century than a European in the 17th century. But a Jesuit priest like Chrétien Leclerc in the 17th century, he did not share this view. He would have viewed individual liberty as animalistic. He thought it was weird and scandalous that Native Americans didn't live in a society where people had to pay homage to other people, a hierarchical society where some people have to submit to a higher authority. But the Jesuits, like Leclerc and others, found themselves kind of startled and impressed by the counter arguments that Native Americans like this man were offering them. And it was exactly this form of debate, rational, skeptical, empirical, conversational, that eventually came to be identified with the European Enlightenment. Critiques like this one had an enormous impact on European thought. And eventually these critiques evolved into arguments about the nature of authority, social responsibility, personal freedom. As it became clear to Europeans that most indigenous Americans saw individual autonomy and freedom as consummate values, they organized their lives in a way to minimize the possibility of becoming subordinated to the will of another person. And the Native Americans viewed European society as essentially one of constantly fighting unfree people. Europeans reacted to this in a variety of different ways. Some, like the Jesuits, like Leclerc, condemned the principle of freedom outright. Others, like the Enlightenment philosophers, came to see this as an appealing social proposition. So this is where we get to kind of the ideas of Enlightenment political philosophy that really come to be crucial for the colonies in the 18th century. Britain was, by the 18th century, the greatest naval and commercial power in the world. And this was something that British subjects on both sides of the Atlantic prided themselves on. They also believed that Britain's system of government, where you had a combination of a king and a very powerful parliament, was the superior form of government. The concept of liberty had become central to British identity. Power and liberty were, so 18th century Britons believed, naturally opposing forces. And between them lay the rule of law, the right to be represented in government, individual rights in common law, and checks on absolute power. These ideas were very powerful. They permeated most of British society at the time, and they translated over into the colonies as well. Now, there are two isms that we have to consider here: republicanism and liberalism. And the first thing you need to know about these terms is that they really don't have anything to do with their current meanings in our society today. So republicanism has really nothing to do, republicanism in the 18th century anyway, has nothing to do with the current Republican Party in the United States. And the 18th century notion of liberalism has really nothing to do with our current understanding of the word liberal. So when you see these words, don't automatically assume they mean the same thing in history that they do today. This is one of those times where we have to set aside our modern understandings of things and remember that the meanings of words in the past can be different from the present. So what is republicanism? Republicanism is the idea that virtuous, economically independent citizens should be playing an active role in public life. And this is what is going to prevent political tyranny. Virtue in this sense meant not simply personal morality, but a willingness to put aside one's own personal self-interest and work for the common good. The thinking was that a citizen could only be virtuous if he, and in the 18th century it was always he, was economically independent, which in practical terms at that time was almost synonymous with owning land or property. You could not be virtuous if you were dependent for your livelihood on someone else. Liberalism is the idea that all individuals possess natural rights that no government should violate. The leading philosopher of liberalism was John Locke. He wrote a very influential book called The Two Treatises of Government in 1680. Locke believed in the idea of the social contract, that government is formed by a mutual agreement among equals, who in Locke's time were, of course, all male heads of households. And the purpose of government was to protect the life, liberty, and property of individuals. And if the government did not do these things, Locke wrote, individuals had the right to rise up and overthrow that government and establish a new government that would protect people's natural rights. And so, according to this philosophy, protecting life, liberty, and property required that a person's personal life and their personal concerns should not be interfered with by the state. Now, liberalism and republicanism have some common threads. They work together. Both of these ideas inspired a commitment to constitutional government, limited government, and restraints on the power of the state. Both emphasized property as being the foundation of freedom. And both of these philosophies gained a strong foothold in 18th century America. And we are going to see how these ideas, which, as I've argued, have their origins in the encounters between Europeans and Native Americans, are going to eventually lead us to the American Revolution. And that's something we're going to be covering next week. All right, so that's it for today, and I will see you guys all in class.